This is the motion debrief for round 9 of Career Worlds. Before I get started, I just want to give a quick caveat for a few things. The first is that what's going to happen in this debrief are just my thoughts about this particular motion and what makes it a good round 9 motion, as well as some thoughts about possible clashes and lines of analysis you could run. This may not end up being comprehensive, and in fact, you may find that you have run arguments that I have not mentioned here. This does not make them bad arguments. It simply means that I have a limited amount of time and haven't been able to cover all of these arguments. The second is that the arguments I'm going to mention in this round are not automatically winning, meaning if you think you ran this argument, please don't get angry if you think your judge didn't end up crediting it, because keep in mind that whether or not an argument is winning often depends on how well you run that argument, how well other teams in your room respond to that argument, and generally how your round plays out as a whole. So if you do have any more questions about the way your specific round 9 played out, please go look for your chair judge and ask them for specific feedback. This is just going to be general motion analysis. Right, so just to make sure that we are all on the same page for this motion before I get started, the round 9 motion is: this House believes that states should classify organized crime syndicates as terrorist groups. Classification as a terrorist group would legally allow law enforcement to pursue tactics such as targeted extrajudicial killings, reducing barriers to law enforcement gathering evidence, using military force, criminalizing membership, etc. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with just explaining what I think the criteria for a round 9 motion should be, then going to go into some general thoughts about this particular motion in terms of things you should look out for and some common pitfalls before going into analyzing the Gov case as well as the opposition case for this. And I hope through all of that, you will be able to see how this motion meets the criteria for a round 9. All right, so first of all, a round 9 is the final round before a break for a WUDC tournament. And this means that teams have been progressively sorted from round 1 up to now. Your round 9 should theoretically have the most accurate sorting of teams so far, because teams have been power matched for the past 8 rounds. This should mean that in your round 9, all teams are at the same approximate skill level. What does this mean for the round? Well, first of all, it means that even though all your rounds should be balanced and accessible, they should be deep and engaging, your round 9 is especially important because you need to ensure that all the arguments are easily accessible so as to not put undue burdens on top half teams, while also making sure that you are offering a significant amount of depth for closing half teams in very high level rooms. Because assuming that an equally high level team is able to cover quite a lot of material in the opening half, you need a closing half to have a fair chance to extend in order for the break to also be fair. The second thing you probably want to note is that because it's a round 9 motion and it's the last round before the break, you want it to be a round that tests teams on their skill at debating, this game that we all play, as opposed to any kind of spec knowledge that might tilt the debate overly in their favor. So you will want a winning team to have won because they were able to make better arguments or substantiate logically better than every other team in the round, not because there was just one winning piece of spec knowledge that enabled them to take this round over everybody else, because I think that also messes a little bit with the fairness of the break. The last thing is, because it's round 9, for many teams, this is going to be their last round of the tournament. And so that means you want to have a motion that ensures that all rooms are able to have a good debate, not just the top rooms. So in that case, you want the motion to be very accessible, even to teams who are slightly less experienced. Why is this motion actually quite an accessible one, despite the quite long definition of what a classification of a terrorist group is? Well, first of all, it's accessible because this is actually a topic, or organized crime syndicates are actually a topic that are very commonly in popular media. So you can look at the mafia, for instance, in public imagination, or you can look at Netflix shows such as Narcos. The second thing to note is that organized crime syndicates actually operate globally. You can find them in many different regions around the world. So it's highly likely that everybody in the room at least knows what they are and is able to discuss at least some detail, some examples, or give some guesses about what these organized crime syndicates are able to look like. The third is there are some very intuitive arguments that immediately appear on both sides, even if you're a team that is not hugely experienced. And I think that kind of means that this motion functions well in a variety of rooms, because as you will see as I go through motion analysis later, there is a lot of depth in this motion, but it is also accessible as well as intuitive, and it makes for a clean and good debate for teams to sort of end their tournament with. All right, so that's the criteria for a round 9 motion. What are some general thoughts about this motion to start with? The first is that I think it is quite tempting but erroneous to make this a debate solely about crime syndicates being bad and then listing all the harms of crime syndicates without acknowledging that organized crime is already illegal. So I suspect this is a pitfall that some teams actually ended up falling into, but because organized crime is already illegal, this debate probably revolves around, first, what additional impact do you get when classifying them as terrorist groups rather than continuing to prosecute them as domestic criminals? Second of all, under what circumstances do you think it is legitimate to expand state power? Or third of all, how you think this is going to be implemented and what the consequences of that implementation will be. The second thing I will say about this debate is that characterization is likely to be something that's hugely important, because many teams are going to clash over what crime syndicates look like or what classification as terrorist groups look like. And a tendency I have found in characterization clashes is for teams to essentially just counter-characterize without necessarily giving reasons for why their characterization is more likely to be plausible or true. And second of all, without engaging in the other team's characterization. This essentially means that you end up with debates that just sort of float past each other and don't necessarily engage, because both teams are operating on quite different premises and characterizations and assumptions about what this world is going to end up looking like. So what are some key pieces of characterization and characterization clashes that I think are important in the round? First of all, I think you probably need to discuss organized crime syndicates. And I think on government, you will probably characterize these as groups that engage in particularly harmful types of criminal activity. You would definitely push for the idea that they engage in mass violence, kidnappings, probably drug and weapon trafficking, or even human trafficking, basically trying to show that there is something extremely harmful about them that necessitates larger response than what we currently have in status quo. Whereas on opposition, you probably want to counter-characterize a bit and point out that it's also true that they provide necessary services and infrastructure to downtrodden areas. I think that both of these characterizations can be true at the same time for the same crime syndicate, and it is therefore exceptionally important for teams to try and engage with the arguments that rest on the opposing team's characterization. The second thing you probably want to look at is who gets to decide which groups are classified as terrorist organizations? Who implements these measures? Are they likely to be trustworthy? In this case, I think it's just a question of which side is more able to show either this will be implemented well or it's going to be implemented badly. But I want to raise a specific problem that I think may arise. So you need to keep in mind that characterization that strengthens one part of your argument may also actually weaken another part of your argument. So for instance, if you are characterizing these states as being hugely corrupt and complicit in the harms of organized crime syndicates, then that is both a reason why current measures are insufficient and a reason why this policy is likely to be implemented badly. So your characterization, whichever one you pick, is likely to impact both your it's likely to have impacts on different arguments that you are trying to run. So it's very important to just sort of take a step back and see whether or not your characterization is strengthening one part of your argument while also weakening another part. And if that is the case, to do something to sort of mitigate that, or to perhaps neaten your characterization a bit, or draw some nuance there and say, here is why it actually strengthens both parts of our arguments. Okay, so what does this look like on proposition? And what are some of the things you should look out for? First of all, I think on proposition, you should always have a clear and detailed policy. Of course, in this particular motion, some of your policy is already provided. but it is always good to provide additional illustration of what this looks like and what parts of the policy you are likely to use and when you are likely to use these parts. Keep in mind as well that when a motion provides you with a policy, it often points you in certain directions. So it's essentially a clue to you for which direction your case should end up taking. So each part of the policy or each part of the definition that is provided here is presumably used to solve a slightly different problem. And you should therefore take that as a hint to illustrate the corresponding problem as well as to map the solution as it comes out within your case. So what is it useful to do from Gov? It is favorable from government to point out that different tools are used to expedite different outcomes. Targeted extrajudicial killings are in the motion, but they are highly unlikely to be weaponized as a first resort and similarly unlikely to be used against small-time criminals. The second thing you probably want to note is that reducing barriers to information gathering basically means you are allowing for evidence that is illegally collected to be admissible in court, and it provides you with more avenues for data collection and therefore more data overall. The third thing you probably want to point out is that even when you classify groups as terrorist organizations, reviews and checks and balances still exist. You are simply increasing the speed at which you are able to carry out this process, as well as increasing the amount of resources that you are able to devote to this process. So that is preemptive framing to try and cut out some of opposition's harms that this will be implemented in an absolutely unjudicious way. The last thing is that you probably just want to point out, all in all, this just increases the options available for law enforcement in lots of areas where the law enforcement is currently set up to fail. So this has taken the quite bare bones definitions that you were given in the motion itself and turned it into a slightly more comprehensive policy where you are able to show, first of all, there is a spectrum of situations where you are likely to use this. So it's not just that you are jumping straight to targeted extrajudicial killings, which is going to be hard, which are just like hard to defend to use all the time, right? But second of all, it also tells you that checks still exist and that allows you to caveat against some of the op stuff. Now, after you have come up with this mechanism, presumably you are also talking about a problem of some kind, right? Like, what are all of these mechanisms supposed to help you solve? Probably you want to talk about how status quo doesn't work, because very often when you have a policy, it's because something right now is broken. So why does status quo not work? Many reasons. Corruption, for instance, intimidation and threats of violence against law enforcement. That means that law enforcement is unlikely to properly crack down on organized crime syndicates. You often have underfunded police departments who are unable to keep up with vast criminal networks and resources. You have criminal networks that are able to draw on multiple sources for recruitment, whereas police departments and law enforcement departments are often understaffed and overworked. All of these things are reasonable things that you can say for why status quo is just not working at the moment. How then do you proceed from here? I think it's quite tempting to just jump straight into, well, here are the problems, and here is how our solution just becomes more effective. But I think it is also just useful to take a step back and think about why you think this is a legitimate expansion of state power before you even start going into why you think it is an effective use of state power. I think there are two ways you can sort of run this argument. I hesitate to call it like a principal argument because I'm not sure if it is a full principal argument, but I think there are two broad directions you can take, which are not actually mutually exclusive. The first is to just point out that these groups have caused disproportionate harms to society, to the point of killing over 100,000 civilians in the past, over 100,000 civilians within very short spans of time in Mexico, drug cartels in Latin America. They often kill individuals, kidnap individuals, extort individuals, engage in trafficking. All of these just really bad things that organized crime syndicates have engaged in that allow you to justify harsher treatment of them, because by breaching all of these rights of civilians that you have promised to protect, they have also in some ways given up their own rights to legal protection from the state. So that's the first layer, I think, which is probably the more intuitive layer that teams reach for when they first see this, which is also good because earlier we talked about motions needing to be both accessible and intuitive for all teams. The second layer that you might want to run on this is that actually the other reason why it's legitimate to treat them as though they are a terrorist force is precisely because they are a terrorist force intent on undermining the existence as well as the legitimacy of the state. How does this work? First of all, keep in mind there is an active incentive to do this because the destabilization of political and economic structures create favorable conditions for organized crime activities. So it's just easier to carry out all your organized crime when law enforcement is broken and cannot target you, where legal institutions are highly corrupt, and when the judicial system itself is just ineffective and broken and people don't really dare to approach it for help. But the second thing is thinking about how exactly how exactly organized crime syndicates do this. So first of all, they actively disrupt law enforcement investigations through violent threats against law investigating officers or violent threats against justices and all of this stuff. The second is they explicitly bribe and coerce judges into more lenient sentencing policies. The third is actually just to point out that many of these people also advocate very heavily against the introduction or continuation of government policies against organized crime groups through their capacity as private citizens at the head of business enterprises and all of these things. So put together, all of this leads to immense destabilization of the state. It prevents the functioning of the state because the state is no longer able to carry out its vital role as a protector of justice or a provider of justice for individuals, which number one means that its institutions become a lot shakier, but also number two means that individuals start losing faith in these institutions, which then perpetuates this sort of vicious cycle about your state like sort of crumbling. And so because you can sort of frame this as this group is combating the state by actively undermining its institutions and legitimacy, there is a sort of sovereignty breach here that allows the state to then treat them as sort of foreign actors who are trying to destabilize the state as opposed to simply domestic criminals, because domestic criminals work within the confines of the justice system. While they break laws, they don't break the justice system as a whole. That is untrue for these people. All right. The third thing is probably just like a claim about crime by association, which is just to point out it is okay to treat them as terrorist groups because very often organized crime syndicates cooperate with terrorist groups. So you can think about the cooperation, for instance, of FARC and Colombia drug cartels in the 90s, which is actually a very symbiotic relationship where both sides have an incentive to do this because they can leech money and economic power off each other. It means that terrorist groups can get access to specialist skills like smuggling across borders. Both sides can access a broader range of recruits. All of this means that very often there is an incentive for criminal syndicates as well as terrorist organizations to work together. And, that is also a good reason to classify them as terrorist organizations if they are frequently associating with each other anyway and aiding and abetting each other's activities. Okay, so that's all the stuff about why it is legitimate. Let's move on to why it is effective. And I think there is also quite a lot here, which means that there's quite a lot of depth to extend. Well, I think even in legitimacy, there's probably depth because it's very unlikely that one team's just going to cover all of that while also covering all the efficacy stuff. So as you can see, it means there are backup extensions even in very high level rooms. Okay, so with effectiveness, we've already done a lot of setup about why current measures are maybe insufficient. Here are a few more reasons. Number one, it's very easy to buy influence. Number two, it's very easy to evade investigation and prosecution and jail time. Number three, if you're an important person in a syndicate, you are often able to scapegoat smaller members because those are the people who do not have the protection of the crime syndicate, meaning that even if your law enforcement is arresting people, it's arresting this sort of small-time drug runners as opposed to anybody that's actually in like management of the cartel itself. Number four, it is difficult to get people to testify because of corruption, as well as the fact that they are scared about retaliation by the criminal syndicate. What then do you do to solve this? Number one, you just get speed, right? And speed is very important. You get faster clearance, you get information faster because you're able to use a variety of sources to get that information. You have a faster ability to act on that information before the syndicate realizes that you possess this information, keeping in mind the characterization that the syndicate is likely to be corrupt and therefore able to preempt quite a lot of your moves, when you actually get that information. So you want to move as quickly as possible in order to prevent that. The second thing you probably want to point out is that you are also able to get the targeted killings of leaders as an effective mechanism to get some kind of efficacy. What does this do? First of all, even if it doesn't succeed, you are probably able to change the incentives of leaders to be a bit less prominent or to sort of wind down their activities a bit, because now the threat becomes more personal, because targeted killings are probably only targeted to people who are the most prominent members of the organization as opposed to the foot soldiers of it. So you change their incentives because now there's a personal danger, which means they are more likely to reduce violence or to try and escape your attention by reducing the cartel's activities. The second is, if it succeeds, it's also really good for two reasons. Number one, it removes organizational direction because very often the leader is the person coordinating all your various splinter cells. Without the leader, it is good because now these cells are a bit at a loss. There is a power vacuum. There's going to be a lot of infighting within the cartel to try and figure out who's going to be the next leader. And when there is infighting within the cartel, at least it's directed inwards. It weakens the cartel as opposed to harming the society around it. And third of all, because of all this infighting, it probably reduces the organizational effectiveness, at the very least in the short run. And when it does so, the state is then more able to divert resources to sort of taking down the splintered remains of this organization, as opposed to having to tackle it at full strength with limited resources. The third way you are probably able to get efficacy is by changing the risk-reward threshold for people when they choose to cooperate with these organizations. So first of all, you could probably argue you deter people from joining this organization to a certain extent. Second of all, you probably deter corruption to a certain extent, because association with terrorists is significantly more severe than association with criminals. And third of all, you may actually get more people coming forward to testify now that it's painted as a national security threat, as opposed to just a crime, a gang. The impact of all of this is that you probably get information, so you are able to reduce attacks or stop attacks before they happen. You are able to reduce their level of influence within society. You get more information that allows the government to take more decisive action. You reduce violence and corruption in the short run, which in the long run means you can start targeting a weakened cartel as opposed to one at the peak of its power. And reducing cartel powers even in the short run allows more long-run rebuilding of institutions to take place because they are no longer around to continually destabilize institutions. All right, so those are like some thoughts about efficacy. I think there is quite a lot to unpack there. Of course, I went through a lot of it extremely quickly. So if you were actually running it in a debate, you would, try to analyze a lot of it in a lot more detail. The last thing you probably want to just note is that transnational crime for many organized crime syndicates is a real thing. So organized crime syndicates often operate across borders. You can see this in Central America, Southeast Asia, West Africa, just a lot of regions in the world. Why is this the case? First of all, because drug, weapon, and human trafficking is just profitable, and a lot of that goes across borders for maximum profitability. So you have an economic incentive to do it. But second of all, you also have an incentive to do it because it allows you to hide out from the governments of both countries, because there isn't that much like international cooperation at the moment. Third of all, there is increasing instability, which tends to spill across borders, which allows these organizations to consolidate power and hence expand outwards. What does this particular motion give you? It gives you the ability to enforce laws across borders, and it probably means that you're able to more adequately tackle transnational organizations than you otherwise would be. All right. I think that is it for the Gov. Again, keep in mind that this is probably not comprehensive, just like some thoughts about how you might take this motion and why I think it is deep enough on Gov to meet the criteria of being a good round 9 motion. All right, now let's go to the op, because I think there is quite a lot here as well. The first thing you probably want to do is to just recharacterize the status quo. How would you do this? Number one, you would point out that syndicates operate in areas where the state is largely already absent, because states cannot take over areas, or are very syndicates are highly unlikely to take over areas that are already efficiently and effectively governed by a legitimate and responsive state. That's the first piece of framing you want. The second thing to point out is that because this is the case, syndicates also provide valuable services, and because of state failure. So state failure has actually allowed gangs to exert social control in local communities through actions of solidarity and care, as opposed to what OG and CG will frame as traditional violent coercion. So for instance, this looks like gangs in Mexico and Colombia distributing food parcels and medicines, while also sort of policing and instituting lockdowns during COVID because the state government had just failed at doing any of these things. So as a result of that, you can tell that syndicates do provide, in some ways, a valuable service for society. The third is to just point out that in many cases, syndicates have an active incentive to treat people well, because these people are the consumers of their services, compared to governments who may not have this active incentive to care about people in rural populations, especially given that we are talking about places where state infrastructure is almost non-existent and state presence is similarly, non-existent. So all of this put together means that while the syndicate has come in to sort of replace the services of the state, it has done so because the state had failed in its duty to its people already. And it means that there's already going to be very high levels of distrust of the state in this area, exacerbated by a policy which is perceived as cutting off a lifeline to these people. Okay, so that's the first bit of framing that I think can actually take out quite a lot of framing if opening government goes for the first strategy of proportionality of harm causes these groups to proportionality of harm, as well as their second framing on Gov of this is an incursion of sovereignty by the state because you are eroding state institutions. And this points out that rather than these organizations actively eroding state institutions where they are already strong, on the contrary, they have come in where state institutions are very limited and have tried to build up alternative institutions because the state has failed to provide. All right. The second thing you want to do from opening opposition is to probably explain what your alternative is. You could probably go for status quo, but I think it is probably also more useful to try and sidestep some of these issues by pointing out how you could solve the problems that government is discussing while using, less invasive or less violent methods. The two things I can think of right at the moment is to, first of all, just to pour more resources to underfunded law enforcement departments in order to tackle already illegal activity. So tackling the crimes themselves rather than the existence of the organized crime syndicates. And second of all, on the government focusing resources on building up state infrastructure and then competing politically by building local goodwill, thus cutting off additional support to these particular crime syndicates. So because you have painted a situation where crime syndicates essentially attracts people because they have replaced institutions, the way to then attract people back from them is to replace those institutions, and you can sort of try to do that. All right. So what would you do in response to some of the Gov's principle stuff about disproportionate harm and giving up legal rights? You would probably point out that, first of all, in principle, these are just disproportionate actions compared to the harms actually committed by the criminal syndicates. Second of all, that it targets people who are very likely coerced to be in this group because of their lack of other alternatives. So it's going to target the most vulnerable individuals, the people that had the fewest alternatives, that were the most pressured to join this, because these are also going to be the people who are put in the most dangerous situations and are not shielded by the syndicate because they are not like middle managers or in positions of power. The third thing is to probably just point out that on a principle, like on just like a non-practical level, even if there was this perfect equivalence between syndicates and terror cells, because the state already has disproportionate power compared to individuals, they should never be allowed to carve out special powers for themselves that would increase their power over individuals even more, as well as allow them to wield this power with impunity and even fewer checks than they currently do. So I think all of that stuff can be expanded in much greater detail that I am doing here. And all three of those, I think, can be run independently or together. The second thing I think, is the standard and very intuitive argument from opposition, which is that this just worsens the behavior of crime syndicates, right? Like there's a siege mentality, they believe they are being targeted by an outside threat, this is now a matter of life and death survival, so they will fight to survive. They will escalate their current efforts in the hopes of destabilizing law enforcement and reducing their capabilities, so there's an increased urgency now. Third of all, you probably just get more targeted killings of law enforcement officials on their side. Fourth of all, there is no ability for them to de-escalate or to lay down arms or give in, because there is no hope of negotiation or peaceful transition. Because very often the rhetoric we hear is that we do not negotiate with terrorists, versus if they were domestic criminals with hopes for rehabilitation and reconciliation. And you can actually argue that given your alternative of trying to rebuild state institutions, you are more able to offer leniency to those who come forward in the hopes of luring people away from these organizations. So compare this to like status quo, right? Where you do have situations where people do come forward, where crime syndicates also run legal businesses because they need fronts for money laundering as well as actual like economic sources of income, right? So because of all of that, they at least have some incentive to sort of pass as law-abiding citizens, whereas now if you label them as terrorists, you have nothing keeping them in check and they will start escalating, or at least that's the argument. The third thing is probably just an extension of this, which is that there is increased collateral damage, meaning not only do law enforcement get more targeted, everybody else does too. So here you would probably point out that governments are quite bad at determining guilt or membership in an organization. If you consider how states actually are really bad at prosecuting white nationalism as domestic terrorism, that might give you some hints that any extension of power in this case is probably going to look like profiling by the state against people who, you know, are not like very privileged. But third of all, the word terrorist itself justifies a certain level of collateral damage, because now you are using the rhetoric of national security in order to clamp down. This leads to an escalation of conflict with civilians who are caught in the middle. Also in turn leading to increased radicalization of civilians who are targeted because they are suspected of association with very little proof. And this is especially true in areas where the syndicate is already heavily embedded. Last of all, I guess you just get further destruction of infrastructure in this case, right, with more collateral damage. So even if you succeed in the short term, in the long term, you create the very same conditions that causes syndicates to rise again, namely the destruction of infrastructure, the distrust of the state, as well as the lack of plausible alternatives in terms of both economic and security provision. The last thing that you can talk about on op, which I actually just think is quite fun, is about the erosion of checks on the state in the long run. And this is just a claim that a state cannot be trusted to exercise power judiciously, while they are also given the power to determine which instances are considered exceptional and which are not. So these exceptionalism narratives saying this is an exceptional danger, this is a terrorist situation, these narratives are often used to justify suspending individual rights because of some form of pressing necessity. And the logical corollary of this is a dehumanization of the other, because there are certain disposable lives that are not recognized as deserving of various rights. They are outside the normative order of our law, and that means we do not have to extend any kinds of basic protections to them. This is also the same kind of justification you use to sort of normalize things like collateral damage or civilians who are killed or families who are targeted. And the parallel to this is just looking at the war on terror narrative and what this has done to the treatment of suspects, as it has justified more and more extreme forms of treatment, while at the same time granting this veneer of legitimacy to government actions. So I think this is especially true in weak states, right? Where institutions are already not super strong, because the exception tends to become the rule when people that rise to power are then the people who promote the use of this exceptional force, where this kind of strongman leadership is rewarded. All that means is that you get caught in a cycle where, first of all, the use of this force becomes normalized, but second of all, people rise to power on the backs of using this force, which means that you are unlikely to ever sort of roll this force back when the state of emergency has ended. And this also just leads to democratic backsliding in your own state, right? Which is bad because number one, it aligns with the goals of the terrorist groups and syndicates that OG claims that you are trying to protect against. But second of all, it is also bad for the citizens you are trying to protect, especially because it's likely states will weaponize this to consolidate power. The last thing is, I think, just a quite interesting claim that when you have exceptional powers, you don't actually work on a spectrum like Gov tells you you are going to. Instead, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? When you have a justification for terrorist, targeting people as though they were terrorists, you start ignoring things like drugs being a public health problem and instead start thinking of them as being a security issue. And that's how you get to quite a lot of things like the war on drugs in the US and Mexico, where people are increasingly criminalized, but there is significant lack of public infrastructure for public health purposes. Okay, so I think, again, that was quite a lot on opposition. There is definitely a lot there to extend because I think it's very unlikely any one team on top half is going to cover all of those things. So at the end of the day, just to recap what I think these three main clashes are, the first is what additional impact do you get where you classify them as terrorist groups versus any other alternative? Second of all, when you think it is legitimate to expand state power, if ever. And third of all, is this going to be implemented in a useful or effective way? And I think you just have a number of arguments on both sides that can go back and forth on this quite easily. There are definitely other arguments that are also not in the op that I've mentioned, and I would love to hear them if you would like to reach out. But other than that, I hope everybody had a good round 9, and I am wishing you the very best of luck in your future WDC rounds.